I think whether people are in favour of strong government depends very largely on what government it is. And it seems to me that governments of any kind need checks and balances to prevent them doing wrong things. And it seems to me that the present mythology that a government has a mandate to do everything that was in its election manifesto is rather misleading, because the public don't vote for the individual items in manifestos, and therefore there may be lots of things in a government's manifesto which would not be acceptable to the majority of people, and yet they will push them through because they believe they have a mandate. And I think many of those issues which are pushed through need fuller debate in Parliament. The House of Commons is almost completely ineffective. I heard a Member of Parliament say recently that he thought MPs had fulfilled their function on election night, because the sole purpose of the election was to find out which party had a majority so that you could appoint a Prime Minister, and then they had no further function other than constituency work. And it is rumoured that Mr. Blair famously told his MPs after the last election not to bother attending the Commons because they had no role there but to get out in the country and spread the government word.
To filter down the message to the populace instead.
Yes.
Yes.
And that may be an accurate reflection on the House of Commons as it now is, that it really doesn't perform a function. I think it would make a considerable difference if those reforms were put into place, strengthening select committees and all the other things they propose, but I don't think they do go far enough. The one thing I have misgivings about in the report is the suggestion that there should be more direct popular involvement by presenting petitions and so forth. I can understand why that was put in, but it seems to me that it may well lead to more knee-jerk legislation of the kind we've been suffering from recently. That you get a few thousand signatures to something which hasn't been thought through in detail, and then the government's under tremendous pressure to do something about it fast, and you end up with even more unsatisfactory legislation. So I think that needs much more careful thought, whether direct popular involvement would work. But it's certainly the perception of politicians that you have to do things in order to hit headlines, and so much of government nowadays is aimed at the newspaper headlines in the morning rather than actually solving problems, it seems to me.
As the media as the fourth estate and the role that it's playing.
Yes, I mean a good example was the legislation rushed through in the summer dealing with expenses, and they completely failed to think through the constitutional implications of what they were doing. And the expenses crisis, which is a crisis of confidence, isn't really a constitutional problem, actually. It doesn't affect the way the Constitution works. It affects the way people think about MPs, but that's another matter. It seems to me that those factors you mentioned are part of the strength of the House of Lords, and they're the reason why the House of Lords is actually the most effective part of Parliament at the moment. That they've stopped the government on about 100 occasions in the last 10 years, something the Commons can't do. Even though the Labour peers are the largest single party grouping in the Lords, they're still able to follow their consciences because they've got tenure and are not subject to electoral pressures and whips and so forth. And it seems to me that I'm afraid here, all three major parties at the moment, because they all seem to favour an elected House of Lords. It seems to me that electing the House of Lords would be disastrous. It would be the end of the second chamber, really, as an effective body, because they'll just be a clone of the Commons. Not necessarily a political clone. I mean, it might be if you had an election for the House of Lords at the same time as the general election, almost exactly a clone. But even if you had elections at different times, so that you get more votes against the sitting administration, you're still going to get only professional politicians standing for office, and probably quite a few, because it's a rather nicer position not to have to worry about constituency affairs. And you're going to get the political class in the House of Lords, subject to all the party political pressures, and they won't be able to take an independent view. So I think it's very important that the House of Lords should be largely elected and should represent different groups who are not part of the political class as we know it. What's wrong with the House of Lords is not that, it's the appointment system under which we get failed MPs and unseated MPs and speakers who've been effectively sacked, put into the Lords. That has to stop, and there has to be some other system of appointment. But we found a way of appointing judges, and I don't see why it can't be done for the House of Lords. The problem, of course, is that a peerage is an honour as well as a political position.
And it causes obfuscation because of the mix.
Some people are content simply to have the honour, and indeed have been given a peerage simply to be an honour. Mm. And I'm not quite sure how you solve that unless you divorce peerages completely from the House of Lords and call it a Senate. I wouldn't myself want to do that. I would have hoped that some other way could be found, and that one should put up with a certain number of anomalies, if on the whole the system works, which I think it does, far better than the House of Commons anyway. Most commentators agree that the House of Lords is immensely effective because of the width of expertise and range, even social classes and racial groupings in the House of Lords is far more diverse than the House of Commons, and very difficult to create that if you are starting from scratch. It has actually worked surprisingly well given the defects in the appointment system. The most disastrous decision was Mr. Blair's abolition of the Lord Chancellor in the old form. We still have a Lord Chancellor in name, but he's a politician in the thick of politics who might well aspire to higher office, for all we know, or a future Lord Chancellor might. He clearly regards the Ministry of Justice as being his more important role, whereas the old-style Lord Chancellor maybe had too much power, but he held the highest secular office of state in the country, wasn't going to move on to any other position, and had a very heavy personal responsibility which went with the office for being personally responsible for appointments. Whereas what we have now is a minister who is, as I say, possibly going to move on to other things and is therefore subject to political pressures, who is making a choice between several candidates, or he may be making a choice between several candidates, and therefore he can shelter behind there being a committee that's looked at it. It's not really his decision in the way the Lord Chancellor was responsible for finding people. And I can see potential problems there, especially since the government has made it quite clear it wants to set certain rules, guidelines for appointing judges. They should be more diverse and less emphasis on experience at the bar and so forth. Those sound wonderful, except that one suspects they're about political influence, at any rate at the higher levels. I think there are different issues with appointing magistrates who are laymen, but at the higher levels of the judiciary it's terribly important to appoint the right people. No, it's a step in the right direction. It doesn't go nearly far enough. It doesn't seriously tackle the problem of special advisors, which is a great cause for concern. Obviously there's a need for special advisors. Scientific advisors, so on in the news at the moment, are very necessary, but there is a general feeling that it's got out of hand, and they're not subject to the same code of practice. Indeed, they are exempted by this statute from the duty of the civil service to be independent. And the government has also rejected the advice from Lord Wilson, the former Cabinet Secretary, that special advisors should not ever have authority to hire and fire civil servants, and the government wants to retain that. It seemed to me that governments until recently accepted certain restrictions on their own power because they knew that sometime they were likely to be replaced by a government of a different complexion, and if they introduced anything which tended towards absolutism, then that absolutism would be taken up by people they might find less appealing. And I think that tension, the feeling that you were in power for a certain amount of time and then someone else would probably take over, because that has been the pattern over the last century or so, restrain governments from wanting to go too far. Whereas there's a distinct sense nowadays, it seems to me, that governments are really living for the short term. They're interested in tomorrow's headlines, and they don't seem to worry about setting precedents. And so all the conventions which, as Mr. Straw recently said, existed in hearts and minds and habits, have been thrown away. And you can only do that once you've thrown away all those conventions and practices which had developed over a long time and had sort of worked by general agreement. Then you're in difficulties, because there isn't then anything which holds the government in check except Parliament, and if Parliament isn't doing it, we've only got the judges left. And the point of a written constitution isn't so much to put principles into words, it's about giving power to judges. Well, it seems to me the sole purpose of a written constitution is to give power to judges. That's not perhaps the way the present government sees it, because they don't want to give power to judges. They would like to use it as a declaration of aspirations and so on, which can't be legally enforced. But a written constitution, in the proper sense of the word, is something which binds government, and the only way in which you can bind government is to have a judiciary capable of enforcing a constitution. I often tease my American friends by saying you don't have a written constitution at all. Your constitution is what the Supreme Court says that the words mean, which is often completely different from what the words actually say. And so I think one can lay too much stress on the wording. But the question is whether you're going to give the judges power, but at least if there's a written document within which they've got to operate, that I think gives them rather less absolute power than if you just let them determine principles as they go along.
In this context, when you're talking about a written constitution, are you meaning merely a codification of our existing constitutional principles, as it were, or our existing constitution, or do you mean an entrenched constitution which is not only written down but also cannot be changed unless some specific special procedure is gone through?
Oh, it would have to be entrenched. There's no point having a constitution with judicial review by the judges if Parliament can just change it again every time there's an adverse judicial decision. But of course there are different sorts of constitutions and different aspects to constitutions. There's the Bill of Rights aspect, the human rights aspect, which we've already to some extent got, though without judicial review in the American sense, but we do have judicial pronouncements on the Human Rights Act. And then there's the structure of government sort of constitution, which we don't have. And they can be treated separately. There really has been a sea change, I think, because of the sheer volume of legislation which is being produced nowadays. It's just gone up and up and up. And that in itself, without any of the political or constitutional questions, prevents proper scrutiny. There's just far more being pushed through than Parliament can possibly handle. And I don't know what the solution is, but some solution ought to be found. Government should be more restrained in what they think they can achieve by legislation. But it's led to other problems, for instance fast-tracking of legislation. There's recently been a report on that, under which there's hardly any scrutiny at all. Things are just pushed through in a great hurry, usually on the pretext that there's an emergency, and perhaps in some cases there has been, although it's usually been exaggerated. Sometimes the emergency is merely the reporters waiting for tomorrow's news items, and that doesn't seem to be a very good reason for pushing through legislation through a fast-track procedure. I don't know who draws legislation these days. I think there still are parliamentary council, but I get a sense that a lot of them are probably drawn up by special advisors or somebody else, because they're not worded like legal documents. They'll start out saying the first schedule deals with something or other, and then the schedule contains provisions that ought to be in the body of the statute. So even grammatically it doesn't work as a statute. What it looks like is a skeleton document into which people have put things from the backs of envelopes into schedules, and then try to put it into a better form as it goes through Parliament in great hurry, and it comes out in a sort of unfinished state. And therefore there's a temptation to put into these bills a provision for the minister to rewrite the statute later once problems have arisen. the so-called Henry VIII clauses, which have nothing to do with Henry VIII, incidentally. He couldn't get away with that. He tried to get a clause of that sort through the House of Commons, and they wouldn't allow it in the 16th century. But it's now becoming very regular occurrence to have a sweeping clause giving power not only to amend the statute in question, but any other statute that the minister thinks ought to be amended. And there was one appalling example 2 years ago when, in the Regulatory Reform Bill, that the government wanted power to alter any statute without any limitation at all. And when attempts were made in the Commons to put in safeguards for constitutional provisions, for instance, the government absolutely refused to do it, and we were only saved from that by the House of Lords. And I think this is all a product of sloppy legislation, really. That's the driving force. But the consequence could be very serious in terms of parliamentary scrutiny and the Constitution. Clearly the government is very concerned about the media, as no doubt it should be, because it depends on the media for its continued existence in the way things are at the moment. On the other hand, I think the press tend to sometimes seize on the wrong issues, and certainly the lower forms of the press demanding instant action without reflecting on the desirability of that. So it both are to blame to some extent. I'm not suggesting by any means that the great bulk of the legislation I'm referring to is produced in response to newspaper pressure. That's not true at all. It's part of the psychology of government nowadays, which is that you've got to be constantly passing laws because it looks then as if you're doing something, without always necessarily checking up to see whether they are achieving what you intended.